So this video is about what you have to do to get ISO 27001 certification, and we're going to go into some detail. In particular, we're going to talk about the risk assessment process, which, well, in our opinion, is quite hard to get information on. To get a certification, you have to be audited by an authorised team of ISO 27001 auditors. And they'll visit your organisation, perhaps remotely, for a few days and ask to see evidence that, one, you've done the processes that the standard requires. Two, you've documented the fact that you've done those processes. Three, you've documented the end result of them. Four, you have to show that you have what the standard calls an Information Security Management System, ISMS. And this means that practically you'll need to have an ISMS team. And now, these are people already, within your organisation. And they will have to understand the basic principles of information security as defined by the standard. And they'll have to show that they are constantly working to monitor how your organisation keeps information secure. So what do you actually have to do? Well, you have to set up a team, the ISMS team. This is not necessarily a full-time team, although you may want to have a full-time coordinator for it. You have to educate your ISMS team in the basic concepts of ISO 27001. And you have to go through this thing called the risk assessment process. This will involve the ISMS team, and it will also involve subject matter experts from operational teams. Now, typically this risk assessment is not done in one big rush, so it's more of an iterative process. So each team doing it will have to obviously carry on with their day job, and they will need time for the education to sink in and for all the documents to be written. Now, you have to produce quite a lot of documentation for this. The evidence you've done the risk assessment and the results of that risk assessment. You have to record your own best practices in policy documents and show that you've communicated these to your organisation. And finally, you'll have to prove that you've done something about the risks you've identified, or that you have sufficiently convincing plans to do so. So a reminder, what is ISO 27001? Well, it's a standard that tells you that you must protect your customers' data, the CIA principles. It gives suggestions about how to do that, and that's in another section of the manual. It specifies how to present the evidence that you are doing this. And it insists that you have a team and processes to do it. That's the ISMS. So there are a number of actual standards, but the key parts are these. You've got 27,000, which is simply a glossary and reference to other parts. 27001, that's the important part, the one that tells you what you have to do, and has this Annex A, which is really just headings in 27002. 27002 is serving suggestions for what you might want to do to protect your data. 03 is advice on how to operate an ISMS, and 05 is lots more detail on how to do risk assessment. The main document we're going to be working from, and indeed the main document that the auditors will use when they do an assessment or an audit, is 27001. So now let's look at these CIA principles again. We have confidentiality, you mustn't leak data. Integrity, the data must be accurate and complete. And availability, your users, your customers, have to be able to access their data. Now, a reminder about how you apply these principles in practice. Your data is stored in assets. This is an ISO term. An asset is either some software, networks, servers, laptops, phones, also people. Your data is thought of as living inside these assets, and you protect the data by protecting the assets. And you have to demonstrate you've identified all those assets, you've thought about each one, and all the risks or threats, as they're sometimes called, that would cause it to fail in terms of compromising these three CIA principles. You've got to put in place measures to prevent or fix these risks, or have plans to do so, and you've got to have a team of people who are constantly monitoring this whole area, the ISMS team. ISO 27001 is very opinionated. It tells you how you should think about things, it tells you which documents you have to write and what processes you have to follow. And of course it has its own terminology. Assets, asset owners, threats, vulnerability, risks, on and on. So let's get started. We're going to look at risk assessment and risk treatment, and we're going to look at it in some detail. But the first thing we have to do is to describe the asset register. So as we said, information lives inside assets, and the standard talks about the types of categories that it considers assets. So you've got user endpoint devices, you've got offices, software that you use, networks, servers, that sort of thing. So you have to make a list of them. And here's a very small example of a list. You've got some end user devices, mobile phones, laptops, and so on. And then you've got some software, sales software, support software, office software, and you've got physical offices. So you have your list of assets, but you also need to give each asset an asset owner. That's the person who is looking after the asset, managing it day to day. As well as the asset owner, you have to have a risk owner. And that's the person who is responsible for approving any risk assessment you make and approving the plans that you make to treat that risk if you haven't already done so. And that person is responsible for accepting any residual risk that is left after that. Now, I've shown different asset owners and risk owners, but of course in a small company it could be that the asset owner and the risk owner are the same person, and in fact the same person could own assets and risks for lots of assets. Okay, so that's the asset register. Now let's go back to 27001. In 6.1.2 they say that you shall define and apply a risk assessment process to assess the risks of those assets and then also decide how important those risks are, this criteria for performing risk assessments. This is not a massively complicated thing to do, but it does mean you have to write 2 more documents, the risk assessment process and the risk criteria. And we're going to go into more detail about that in a minute. So you've identified your risk owners. Well, the next thing the standard wants you to do is to go through this process called a risk assessment. So you've got to look at the risks that could affect a particular asset and determine how important those risks are, and then decide what to do about that. Now, in order to do that, we'll need to have a larger team. We'll need to engage with the subject matter experts, possibly the asset owners, possibly the risk owners would be involved, and possibly you'll want to have some ISO consultants to help you with this. You go through that process and then you produce your risk assessments, one risk assessment for every asset. Now, once you've done that once, you hopefully won't need the consultants anymore because you will be familiar with what is required. So you've got your risk assessments. You've evaluated how important those risks are. You've used the risk criteria, which we're going to describe in more detail, and you've prioritised those risks for risk treatment if you haven't already got measures in place. So the other thing you have to do is to produce a statement of applicability that draws together all the necessary controls, why they're there, whether you've implemented them yet, and if you haven't used some of the controls mentioned in Annex A, then why. Now, I should point out this is not just you that has to do this. You as the risk owner. This is a team effort, and of course the ISO consultants will help with the production of this document, but it is yet another document that you have to produce, the statement of applicability. If there are any controls you haven't got yet, you need to form a plan. So there's a number of plans that might need to be made. And then the final stage is that you have to obtain the risk owner's approval. So you have to check with the risk owner for every asset. Are they happy with the residual level of risks? Are they happy with the fact you've already got the controls, or the fact that you have plans to put them in place? And then that is the process. So let's now dig into this terminology of risks, threats, and controls. So let's start with an example. Let's say you've got some software that helps you manage your leads. Well, that's considered an asset. It's a software asset. Let's imagine that you're worried about the fact that the customer details might leak. Well, that is called the threat. And one of the controls you use to mitigate against that threat is to use, for example, multi-factor authentication. Well, that's called a control. So you've got an asset, a threat, and the control that applies to the asset-threat pair to mitigate the threat. And slightly strangely, that whole thing in this little bit of the standard is wrapped up together and called the risk. So the standard sometimes talks about the threat as being a risk, and it uses the two words interchangeably. But in this area where you have to present the risks, you have to collect the information like this. Now, in the real world, of course, you've got asset one and threat one and control one, and then you'll have another control for it, and then another control, and then you'll have another threat for the asset, and then that control will also mitigate that threat, and so on and so forth. You'll actually end up with quite a complicated set of assets and threats and controls, lots of information being duplicated. Well, what you've got to do for the purposes of being audited is to take each asset-threat pair and present that as a risk, as I just described. So you've got your asset, your threat, and the three controls that apply to that asset and threat pair. And similarly, when you consider asset one and threat two, you've got to do the same thing. You end up with another risk, a bundle containing assets, threats, and controls, and so on and so forth. And this is one of the problems with maintaining this information. You've got lots of repeated elements. So we suggest that you store the information on the left-hand side there in some form that you've got objects pointing to each other with no duplication, and then you generate the required documents that may include duplication on the right-hand side. So let's have a look at risk values and risk acceptance criteria. Bottom left there is just a key to the conventions I'm going to be using in the diagram as we build it up. So let's consider a simple asset. So before we had the example of some software. Now let's consider a physical asset, a laptop, what the standard calls an end user device. So we've got our laptop, that's our asset. What's the threat to it? Well, let's say it could be lost or stolen. That's the threat. Now, in order to think about the threat and how important it is, we'll dip briefly into 27005, which contains lots of detail on risk assessment. And there on page 48 we find a table with a consideration of a risk, with the likelihood of the risk being very low, low, medium, high and very high, and the business impacts, very low, low, medium, high and very high. And the idea is that they suggest that you calculate both of these values and use them to generate a final kind of risk importance value or risk value. What we're going to do is to change it slightly. We're going to have the likelihood of the threat displayed on the left there, and then the impact displayed across the top. So you've got likelihood going from very rare to almost certain, and the impact going from insignificant to severe. Now, as well as the description of these, the likelihood and the impact of the threats, we can assign numbers to them going from 0 to 4. And we can also combine the likelihood and the impact simply by adding the two numbers up to get a final risk value. And we can do that for all the cells in the matrix. And one way of using this is to say that the accepted level of risk would be 0 or 1. And this would mean that the combination of the likelihood and the impact generates a risk value which is acceptably low. Okay, well, let's go back to where we were with this lost or stolen threat. And let's see. Well, we could say that the likelihood of a laptop being lost or stolen during the lifetime of the organisation is, well, it's almost certain. So let's put that there. What's the impact? Well, let's say that we've assessed it to be moderate. So then if we combine almost certain and moderate, we get that value as the risk value. So we give that value to the lost or stolen threat. And that's how we calculate the risk value for a particular threat. Okay, so we've got our asset and our threat, and we've given it a risk value. What do we do now? Well, we've got to consider the controls from Annex A. So, 27001, it has an Annex A, which are the headings that you will find in 27002. So if we go there to 27001 and look at Annex A, look at section 8.1, we find user endpoint devices. Well, information stored on, processed by, or accessible via user endpoint devices shall be protected. Well, there's not much detail there, is there? Well, if we look at the heading of Annex A, it says these are directly derived and aligned with those in 27002. Aha, that's where we've got to go to find out the suggested controls. Okay, 27002, let's go there, and what do we find? 8.1, user endpoint devices. And yes, they've got lots of suggestions. Now, just for the purposes of this video, I'm going to take the ones that the parts of the standard that I've highlighted there, put them all together, and we're just going to consider those for the purposes of this video to keep everything relatively simple. Okay, so that's what we've got to consider as we continue with our risk assessment. So back to the laptop and the fact that it could be lost or stolen. Okay, Well, yes, I should say that the first thing it says at the top there is that the organisation should establish a topic-specific policy on the secure configuration and handling of user endpoint devices. So we have to write this document, this policy document, that specifies what should happen in this area. And what's it going to look like? Well, it's going to look something like this. There'll be, a document which will have various sections, and it'll say, consider this, don't do this, do that, do the other. That's what we mean by a policy document. So the first control we might think of is, well, if it's lost or stolen, we will encrypt the disks. And look, yeah, that's suggestion H in the standard, storage device encryption. Great, we're on the right track. We're already doing that. Fantastic. We consider other things we would do. Well, have cable locks. Cool. Well, yeah, that's mentioned in the standard as well. Requirements for physical protection. And there's also a section under user responsibility that says users should be advised to physically protect user endpoint devices. Cool. Okay. And we carry on. So we might think about remote disabling. Again, that is suggested as well. Automated backups. Okay. Yeah, that's also suggested. Okay, what else might we want to do? Well, if it's lost or stolen, we might want to report it. Yep, that is mentioned in registration of user endpoint devices, or at least it's hinted at that if you got these things registered, you probably want to report when it gets lost or stolen. You might want to replace it. Now, this is not mentioned in the extract of the standard I've got up on the screen here, although it is hinted in another part. So, but the point here is that you don't have to use only the suggestions in 27002. That's just a starting point. So you can have other controls that are not necessarily mentioned. And what else? Okay, let's think about having a screen timeout. So it's lost or stolen, there's a screen timeout so that people can't see what's going on that laptop. Well, yeah, that's kind of hinted at by log off. The user responsibility is to log off active sessions and terminate services when no longer needed, though it's being done automatically. Okay, so that was lost or stolen. Now we just carry on with the other threats. So if the laptop's rendered unusable by an accident or a hardware failure, let us say we've assessed that as being a risk level of 4. Well, automated backups would help in this case as well. We'd obviously want to report it, and we might need to replace it, or we might need to repair it. We might decide that it's best to repair it. And we carry on in this way. And we can think about a malware infection. Okay, report it. We have an antivirus that is mentioned, section I, protection against malware, and so on and so forth. So we take an asset, we look at all the threats, and we consider all the controls with an eye to what is happening, what is being suggested in 27002. Now, the next thing we have to do is to provide evidence. In this case, I've shown in blue evidence that is, if you like, written instructions. They might be instructions to the user. It might already be in the policy. The policy could state that users must log off active sessions, or it might be that there's some other description or advice to users on some internal website that says that. But all of that is evidence that you are implementing those controls, and you have to know where that evidence is to be found. When you are audited, you have to be able to point the auditors at that evidence. As well as this written evidence, there is evidence, or there needs to be evidence, that you are using the software that you say you're using. So encryption of disks, remote disabling, automated backups, etc. Now, at this point, you could, or you will need to show screens from, for example, centralized admin software, showing that, we are applying these things. So we've got assets. Each asset has a number of threats. Along with that, you have a set of controls. You have evidence. And you've been doing all this by referencing what you find in 27002. As I said before, the way you have to present this information is to bundle it up into these things called risks, which contain the asset, the threats, and the controls. Now, there's actually another piece of evidence that I haven't mentioned yet, and it's this. It's people. When you get audited, the auditors will come and look at all your evidence. They'll look at all your documents. That's great. You'll present those. But they'll also want to speak to people. They'll want to speak to members of your ISMS team. And in this particular case, they'll want to speak to your IT guys to say, are you operating the antivirus or the screen timeout or the password manager? So that's another vital part of your evidence. The fact that your people, the people in your team, understand what they're doing, why they're doing it, and can talk to the auditors as you're being audited. So, in conclusion, well, it's complicated, but we can help. We can help with educating your staff. We can help you with setting up the ISMS, advising teams whilst they do the risk assessments, and keeping your teams on track to deliver these. We can help with writing the policies, and indeed writing and formatting all of the other formal documents that the standard requires. What we would say is, don't do this. Don't have some whiskery old bloke sending out a ton of MS Word templates for a confused workforce to fill in and return. That isn't going to work. And in fact, the process that we go through is to work very closely with your teams, helping them build up the risk assessments in stages, answering their questions and educating them in the whole process as they go along and do it. It's very important to not expect to be able to just shovel some templates onto your staff and get them to just magically understand what they're meant to do and fill them in. They need help. So we would also say, beware of buying some nice shiny piece of software that is advertised as producing ISO 27001 documents. It's not that that's necessarily bad, but the problem is that even if you've got some software, you've still got to put effort into entering the right information. And our preference is, wherever we can, to use your existing systems. You've already got documentation, and maybe we can use your systems and just tweak them a little bit to work. Alternatively, we would recommend just using some fairly smart wiki software to organize the information. So understanding is key. We as consultants need to understand your business. We need to understand your technology. By doing that, we can help you understand ISO 27001 so that you can identify and manage risks. We specialise in doing this with startups and with new tech developments within an enterprise. And it's by transferring that understanding, by doing that, that is what will enable your team to be able to continue to operate the ISMS long after we, the consultants, have gone.